Hey everyone, welcome back. It's been a while. I may as well just acknowledge to myself that I have the time and will to make one of these videos about twice a year, and you know what? Maybe that's fine. Though in this particular case, it's actually going to be two videos in relatively short succession because today I'll be taking a look at some of my favorite games that I played in 2021, and it turns out I had way too much to say to fit it all into one video. I realize that I've said this every year over the past several years, and honestly probably will every year to come for the foreseeable future, but 2021 was an exceptionally fucked up year. 2022 found me, as with so many others, in a perpetual state of shock about the state of the world and my personal life, rolling with and adapting to the ever-evolving status quo as best I could, which often was a state barely above simply surviving. 2021, naturally, was a year in which I actually started to process all this trauma, which meant it was an all-time mental health low point. Good things happened this year as we started to approach some warped sense of normalcy. I got vaccinated, started going back to work, started having regular band practices again, started seeing friends and family a bit more frequently and intimately than I was able to last year. But all of that brought with it newfound and unexpected anxieties as I adjusted to a world that was partly post-COVID, but mostly very much not post-COVID. This is all a prelude to explaining that I noticed a change in my video game habits during this turbulent year, which has affected the way that my year-end list looks this time around. It's not really that I played video games any less than I have in previous years, but my approach to them shifted a bit. I found it harder to commit to finishing games. Most games I played this year I put a few hours into, then bounced off of in search of something else, some elusive quality that I was searching for but rarely found. I found myself less concerned with keeping up with brand new releases and going back to the comforts of old games. This tendency led not only to just straight up more retro gaming. I played a lot of PS2 games this year, both emulated and on the actual console that I have with the CRT that I still got, but even found its way into the games that were released this year. There are a lot of remasters and remakes and re-releases on this list, and even the games that are brand new tend to either be a part of series or genres that I have a long history of loving. There's a lot of representation from RPGs, adventure games / visual novels, first-person shooters / immersive sims, and 3D platformers. Turns out this is not the year I realized I actually understood and love grand strategy games or hardcore racing sims. There aren't as many obscure or challenging indie games on here as usual, and this list feels a bit safe, a bit obvious, but also honest. It's an accurate snapshot of my gaming habits of the last year. So with that said, here's how I'm going to break this down. I'm going to talk about a total of 20 games. Actually, it's technically 23 because a few of them I've grouped together for convenience or because that's how they're packaged, but let's not get too deep into the weeds here. For this video, I will be covering two different categories. The first 5 games that I talk about will be older games, games that didn't come out this year. The next 5 will be honorable mentions, games that came out this year that I enjoyed but didn't quite make the cut to top 10. Then in the next video, I'll do the countdown to my actual top 10. And the only rule that I have as a universal for this list is that these games are all games that I actually finished. For the honorable mentions and top 10, the one additional rule that I have is that these games need to have been released this year, but I take a very broad definition of what that means. If a remaster or a remake of an older game came out this year, that counts. If an updated version of a game originally released within the last few years received a wider release this year, that counts. If a game that came out only in Japan previously and finally received a release in this region, that counts. And as may be evident from all these qualifiers, a lot of games fitting these descriptions found their way onto this list. All right, let's get started by talking about some old games. First up on this list is Super Mario Galaxy. I played this game as a part of the Super Mario 3D All-Stars compilation from last year, which packages together Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, and Super Mario Galaxy, none of which somehow I had managed to play before. I honestly can't even talk about how much I enjoyed this game without talking first about how much Nintendo's handling of this package just fucking sucks. They did absolutely nothing beyond the bare minimum to remaster these games and had the gall to make it all a bewilderingly time-limited release. You can't even buy this collection anymore. It was only available for a few months online. And considering how little interest I had in the earlier two games, I basically just bought Galaxy, a 14-year-old Wii game, for $60. I have no idea how people can get mad at other people for pirating Nintendo games at this point. They are practically begging us to with this insulting shit. All that aside, Galaxy really is just a very good game. I actually almost surprised myself a moment ago when I reminded myself that it came out way back in 2007 because it doesn't really feel like it's aged a day. The platforming, level design, music, and art style are all at the top tier of 3D Mario games, and I say that as someone who doesn't necessarily have as much attachment to the series and character as a lot of people. As much as I loved Odyssey from a few years ago, I think I prefer Galaxy because it's such a less unwieldy game. I don't think I spent any more than 20 hours with it, and I more or less 100%ed it because I was just having such a good time exploring the planets and collecting all the stars. Was it worth the $60? I don't know, but I was certainly happy to have finally gotten around to this classic and discovered that it's more or less the perfect Mario game. Next up on my list of old games is Katamari Damacy ReRoll. One of the most fun things about exploring the PS2 catalog is that it feels like the last generation where video games could just be whatever the fuck they wanted to be. The polygonal revolution that happened in the previous generation dramatically opened the possibilities of what a game could be. For a few years there, it felt like the rulebook had been thrown away and developers were free to get as weird with it as their imaginations allowed them to. And Katamari Damacy feels like one of the most confident examples of this. I'd somehow never previously touched this series of roll-em-ups about making a really, really big ball of stuff. The unique control scheme, wacky humor, and catchy soundtrack made for an infectiously joyous experience as documented in the streams that my bandmate Marina and I did earlier in the year of ReRoll, the high-definition remaster of the original game. I'm certainly not suggesting that games have at large lost their sense of experimentalism since this era, but like most other art media, corporate consolidation and means testing have made the AAA space increasingly conservative and formulaic, and the legacy of Katamari itself is a perfect example of this. Just a few years after the release of this game, its developer/publisher Namco merged with Bandai, and while I still enjoy the output of modern-day Bandai Namco, in fact a couple of their games end up later on this list, it's hard to imagine them ever putting out something like this again. Likewise, the director of this game, Keita Takahashi, has transitioned to the indie space, still making delightful games like Wadum, but with almost certainly a fraction of the equivalent budget. Playing Katamari Damacy, it's easy to imagine an alternate video game development timeline where the battle between corporate greed and creative talent wasn't won so decisively by the forces of the former. And eccentric, inventive, and novel games like this weren't squeezed out of the mainstream spotlight. For the number 3 spot, I've got a much more recent old game, and that's Doom Eternal. So I had to include this game on this list because if you watch the Game of the Year video I made last year, you'll see that I relegated this game to the shout-out section. I don't think I was as harsh on it as a lot of the reviewers that I had seen, but I basically did view it as at least a slightly disappointing follow-up to a game that I loved. This year, I found myself replaying it and finding that everything just clicked so much better the second time around, and honestly, I think I did this game so dirty last year because now I genuinely think it's one of the greatest first-person shooters I've ever played. Once you have a handle on its various systems and mechanics, which admittedly are not a trivial learning curve to overcome considering the expectations of simplicity we tend to come to these games with, it's just such an endlessly satisfying series of adrenaline-pumping combat puzzles, audacious and gorgeous set pieces, and kick-ass music. The movement in this game just feels incredible. It's like a character action game stuffed into a twitchy FPS that demands you use all your weapons and abilities strategically and effectively. And once I reached the level where I was able to consistently do that, the effect that it had on my brain just felt like really good drugs. Admittedly, the lore-heavy and self-serious approach to the story in this game still pretty much does nothing for me, and I think its occasional attempts at recapturing the humor of the previous game really just fall flat in comparison. That said, it's Doom. The fact that there were actually a few things to enjoy about the writing of the 2016 game may have been a pleasant surprise, but at the end of the day, that's just not what I'm coming to these games for. I'm coming to rip and tear demons apart while listening to an absurd dubstep gent soundtrack. And in that sense, Doom Eternal is really everything that I want in a sequel. Next, we're going back to 2001 with Ico. This is another classic PS2 game that I had managed to not previously get to, and playing it this year was a really eye-opening experience because I was just constantly connecting the dots for a lot of trends in games over the last 20 years since it came out. It doesn't necessarily feel as completely out of left field as something like Katamari, which just feels like a game that has so little DNA with anything that came before or since. Ico, on the one hand, feels of a piece with The Legend of Zelda and plenty of other action-adventure games that involve exploring dungeons and solving environmental puzzles, but at the same time, its approach to these familiar elements feels so distinct and fresh, even today, despite the fact that I played so many games that are clearly inspired by it. There's a stark minimalism in this game's approach, from its watercolored impressionistic art design to its sparse use of largely ambient music, to its lack of UI, to its limited mechanics, to its story told largely wordlessly. All of these were bold artistic choices for the time, and the distinct atmosphere Ico cultivates is reflected in so many games that came in the generations after it, from all corners of the industry. Whether it's the way The Last of Us inspires a sense of protection over the non-player character you're tasked with escorting, or the lonely majesty and decline of Dark Souls environments, or the bold aesthetics, platforming as storytelling, and player disempowerment of Limbo and Inside. Just so many games, AAA and indie and everything in between, have such clear roots in this 2001 classic. And despite all of that, playing it in 2021 is still a super enjoyable and accessible experience all on its own. For the number 1 spot, I have both Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 3, which I don't have the physical version of because it's like $150 or something at this point. Yes, we are not even to the main list, and I am already cheating by including 2 different games in the number 1 spot. It's my list, you're just gonna have to deal with it. I just couldn't figure out any other way to do this that felt right because Marina and I played through both of these games on stream and both left such an incredible lasting impression on me. Even though I think Silent Hill 2 is the indisputable masterpiece of the two, I just still find myself thinking about both of them and how good they are constantly. So I had technically played 2 before, but it had been a very, very long time. This is another 2001 game. In fact, I'm pretty sure that it came out the exact same day as Eco, which is wild to think about. 2001 was just an unbelievably strong year for classic timeless PS2 games. Anyway, I don't think it was really too long after the game came out that I got it and played it. I was around 11 or 12 at the time, which meant that, first of all, I was way too scared to actually engage in it. I remember playing it with a friend and we used a guide the whole time and just sprinted everywhere and did everything with our eyes half closed because it was just way too much for us. And the age that I originally played this game meant that the story and themes just went entirely over my head. I knew that there was a lot of psychosexual aspects that I didn't understand at the time and that I was really due for a replay of this game, but I honestly didn't expect to be blown away by the story as I ended up being. Silent Hill 2 was more than a decade ahead of horror movie trends in that it's an exploration of trauma, guilt, depression, and loss. That's not to say that horror hasn't always, to some degree, dealt with these themes, but the way that it puts them front and center really does feel startlingly ahead of its time. In both the disgusting imagery and surrealist storytelling, it feels inspired by Lynch and Cronenberg, but while many games to this day struggle to rise above surface-level mimicry of their far more artistically potent reference material, Silent Hill 2 not only builds its own iconic imagery and atmosphere, but engages in its thematic content in ways thoughtful, subtle, focused, and brutal all at once. Cutscenes in this game may have the uncanny valley animations and dodgy voice acting that you'd expect from a horror video game from 2001, but in this case, those aspects actually feel appropriate, contributing to the overall unsettling, dreamlike feel of the experience. On a writing level, it's so far beyond what I generally expect from the quality of even new games. It's bleak and miserable, but not in a way that feels like it's trying to shock you or convince you of its worthiness to be taken seriously. It's an honest depiction of people at their lowest, dealing with the fallout of traumatic events and living their own personal hells of fear and anger and loneliness and regret, all horrifically embodied by the town of Silent Hill. It's pretty easily worked its way into being one of my favorite games of all time. Its follow-up, Silent Hill 3, was one that I had never previously played, and it's a game that I also deeply adore, even if it doesn't strike me as being the same degree of essential. By shifting its perspective from a middle-aged widower to a teenage girl, it naturally shifts its tone. There's actually a consistent sense of humor and attitude to this game. Similarly, by returning to the cult plot of the first game, it pulls back on the psychological turmoil and moral ambiguity to tell a more straightforward story of innocence triumphing over evil. Heather is an immensely likable protagonist, the monsters and environments are more nightmarishly creative than ever, and it's a stunningly gorgeous game. It's pretty incredible how much detail and texture they managed to get out of the PS2 hardware, and especially emulating it in higher resolution as I did on my computer, I kept asking myself why games ever felt the need to improve on the aesthetic perfection that certain games of this era managed to achieve. I also need to shout out the composer of these games, Akira Yamaoka, who turned in 2 of the greatest video game scores of all time with these entries, blending industrial ambience and alt-rock guitars and chill hip-hop beats, resulting in some absolutely iconic music. You're Not There from the Silent Hill 3 soundtrack particularly stands out to me as both a perfect tone setter for the game and also just a great alt-rock song on its own, in line with the sounds that someone like PJ Harvey was exploring at the time. Alright, now on to the honorable mentions, or just numbers 15 through 11 on my Game of the Year list, really. Here are some games that I played this year that were great enough for me to play the whole thing, but either flawed enough or just didn't quite have the overall impact on me to crack the top 10. First up on this list is Tales of Arise. The first of the aforementioned Bandai Namco games that I played this year leaves a very strong first impression. If you had asked me when I was in the middle of this game, I probably would have thought for sure that it had a spot somewhere in the top 10 of this list. It really does so many of the things that I want from a JRPG so well. The story is immediately gripping, following a rebellion against the occupation and enslavement of an entire planet by a neighboring planet, exploring different facets of settler colonialism and subjugation in a way that's maybe not perfect, but definitely a lot more thoughtful and insightful than I would have initially assumed. It's got an extremely likable cast of characters that are well written and acted and gorgeously designed, and the romantic arc between the 2 leads, as formulaic and predictable as it may be, is easy to get emotionally wrapped up in. The combat, at least a few hours in, once you have several party members, is chaotic and mindless fun as you figure out new combo strings and how to deploy character abilities at just the right time to stagger enemies. The well-written and performed symphonic score lends a satisfying grandiosity to the whole thing. All of that praise, in combination with the problem I eventually found myself consumed with in its final act, is a pretty good summation of my ambivalent feelings about the genre expectations of JRPGs at large. The thing is, this game just absolutely refuses to end. The first 35 hours or so feel like a fantastic game that concludes in a mostly satisfying way. At that point, there are obviously a few remaining plot threads to wrap up, but I really didn't expect there to be well over 15 hours of game left, as the story gets mired in convoluted, high-concept bullshit that's nowhere near as compelling as the original conflict, and the gameplay, with no more mechanics left to mete out, becomes a monotonous grind through never-ending hallways and fights. By the end, I was so exasperated with the game that the actually pretty emotionally satisfying conclusion had a fraction of the impact that it would have if the game had simply ended while it was still good. Please, JRPG developers, I'm begging you, sometimes games can be less than 50 hours. In fact, sometimes they would be much better if they were. Anyway, on to the number 4 game on this list, and that's Cruelty Squad. I had a really hard time figuring out where to rank this game. On the one hand, I admire it on so many levels. While the common first impression is to describe it as a shitpost in video game format, that's really not fair to how surprisingly deep and thoughtful it gets with its mechanics, writing, and art. For what it's worth, I unironically adore the look of this game and admired its psychedelic absurdism from the moment I started playing it. The game feels like an artifact from an alternate reality evolutionary chain of immersive sims in its design choices. It's got an active reload that requires you to hold the right mouse button and pull down every time you're out of ammo. Creeping around corners makes your reticle wobble around the screen. There's a virtually inscrutable stock market you can pop up and buy and sell from at any moment. There's even a fishing minigame. It's laugh out loud hilarious and disturbing and alienating, all at the same time. The more time you spend with it, and with the many guides dedicated fans have created on Steam and the surprisingly detailed wiki, two things that really contributed to my experience of this game, the more you realize this game's got a lot going on under its outrageous surface. It has coherent and fascinating lore inspired by philosophy and political theory. Its gameplay systems reveal themselves with time and experimentation, and its level design rewards replay and exploration. It's one of the most biting criticisms of the rich, police, tech companies, and just general life under the ridiculous cruelty of late-stage capitalism I've ever seen in a game. It carries this bitterness through all aspects of itself. Its mere existence feels hostile to the big business of mainstream video game design, and for that, I can't praise it enough. All that said, it wouldn't feel right to say that I particularly had fun playing this game. It's not that I believe video games have to be fun. They have the right to be whatever they want to be, and it's up to us to meet them there or not. But on a moment-to-moment level, it always felt like I was putting up with how it felt in order to appreciate other aspects of it. I don't think that's an intentional or universal part of the experience. I think people who love this game genuinely love to play it. And I wish I were one of those people who reached the end of the last mission and decided to dive back in, discover more secret levels, unlock more augments, buy that house, and mine the rich lore hidden in its corners. Instead, I felt grateful that I had experienced such a singular game and also glad it was over. So, as much as I'd want to rank this high on my list in celebration of its brazen existence, I have to admit that its current placement feels a lot more honest. Next up, we've got Famicom Detective Club, The Missing Heir, and Famicom Detective Club, The Girl Who Stands Behind. This is another example of a couple separate games that I'm grouping together out of convenience. They came out the same day, were sold as a bundle, and feel decidedly meant to be enjoyed as a whole. These are games that I'd want to include on my list even if I hadn't enjoyed playing them at all, because the sheer fact that they exist is such a strange and cool thing. While talking about Super Mario Galaxy necessitated a rant about Nintendo's bullshit, these games represent the opposite end of the company's notoriously baffling decision-making. Two faithful and lovingly crafted, ground-up remakes of largely forgotten NES-era visual novels that had previously only been released in Japan. My only guess is that production of these games must have been okayed after the success of the Phoenix Wright trilogy on the Switch a while back, and in fact, my main motivation for picking them up was to satiate my mystery-solving desire while I waited for the release of the great Ace Attorney Chronicles, but I found that these games from a much older era of adventure game mechanics held up surprisingly well. Don't get me wrong, they both contain frustrations that many games of this style and from this time typically do. Getting stuck is common, as finding the particular combination of dialogue choices that actually advance the plot can be woefully unintuitive, and my natural ability to solve puzzles at times felt hindered by its limited mechanics. That said, having spent a significant amount of my childhood happily wandering lost through Myst and Monkey Island and even some parts of Resident Evil, I think I have a fairly high tolerance for these kind of mechanics that others understandably find maddening. Ultimately, I found myself largely charmed by the quaint but quality mysteries these games offered, and impressed by the care that had clearly gone into the gorgeous and detailed art design, catchy soundtrack, and full voice acting. They're fun and breezy and don't overstay their welcome, lasting only a handful of hours each and landing like a relatively forgettable but nevertheless engrossing young adult mystery novel. A lot more work went into these games than I would have expected from Nintendo, and I'd love to see more like this from them, to restore the more obscure corners of their early catalog, because it's just such a rare treat to experience something like this. In the number 2 spot, we have Scarlet Nexus. This is the second and, in my opinion, generally better Bandai Namco anime-ass action JRPG on this list. Like Tales of Arise, Scarlet Nexus is a game with a large cast of lovable characters and fun, stylish combat. Also like that game, it has an engaging story with surprisingly powerful thematic subject matter. In this case, immigration and environmental justice, as well as criticism of military propaganda and recruitment. Unlike Tales of Arise, this combat doesn't feel like it has one foot in sluggish old-gen design, opting for a lightning-fast, snappy, and satisfying character action style. Also, unlike Tales of Arise, the more off the rails and bonkers this story gets, the more I found myself loving it. And best of all, this game actually ended when my enjoyment of it had naturally run its course, about 25 hours in. This game does still have its issues. I'm not even usually someone who's bothered by fake-out boss fights that you either have to lose or are only meant to get a certain amount of the way through, but wow, there are a lot of those in here. The twists and turns of the story involve a lot of confrontations between allies turned enemies, and unfortunately, the strengths of this combat system shine much brighter when fighting big monsters than when facing off against similarly powered human characters. It's easy to get stuck into unending combos that will instantly kill you and force repeats of unfun battles. Outside of those handful of low points, though, combat in this game is generally a joy. The design of those aforementioned big monsters is both beautiful and grotesque, dazzling amalgams of floral overgrowth and rusting metal and organs and limbs. You use a combination of conventional weaponry and powerful telekinetic abilities to take them on, and can utilize the specialist powers of different members of your party strategically, depending on the situation. Despite being an entirely different genre, the thing it reminded me of the most was Doom Eternal, and as should be clear from earlier, that's very high praise. Outside of combat, you spend a lot of time hanging out with your friends and building Persona-esque social links, and the strong writing of these characters really elevates them from mere archetypes. A lot of fun details are packed into each personality, demonstrably upping the stakes of the admirably unpredictable story. Scarlet Nexus also pulls the trick of having you choose between two playable protagonists, each with their own combat style and narrative perspective, which means that to get the whole story, you technically have to play it twice. But it walks a successful balance here in that it both made me feel wholly satisfied with the ending of my Yuito run, and also excited to dip back in with Kasane when I get the chance. And now, for the number 1 spot in the honorable mentions category, we have Deathloop. Here's another game that I really thought would land a lot higher on the list when I was in the middle of playing it. In fact, at one point I honestly could have seen it having a shot at the top spot. I've been a fan of Arcane's near singular efforts to keep the immersive sim alive in the AAA-ish space since 2011's Dishonored, and I consider both Prey and Dishonored 2 to be minor masterpieces, some of my absolute favorites from their respective years. Deathloop contains so much of the inspired level design and tools for creatively tackling objectives that Arcane's previous games do, but its main achievement is its titular gameplay loop. It takes clear inspiration from roguelike structure, but adds to and convolutes the standard conceit to the point that I don't think I'd really call it a roguelite. I'm not alone in failing to find words to describe it because it's something exceedingly rare, particularly in the relatively high budget realm this game was made in. It's something new, something unique, something that we don't currently have a genre name for. It takes the inherently satisfying replayability of immersive sim sandboxes and makes that replayability a part of the core structure of the game. I was enraptured with this game throughout much of my time with it. I scoured the levels, marveling at the secrets I was uncovering. I built up my abilities and weapons, delighting in the unstoppable, superpowered agent of chaos I had become towards the game's final hours. I luxuriated in the stylish music and art design. I cheered in triumph every time I took down an invading player's Juliana. My infatuation with the brilliant design of this game meant that for much of it, the fact that I was not particularly enjoying the story was easy enough to ignore. In my final play session with the game, I experienced its infamously lazy and disappointing twist and its similarly underwhelming ending, all of which left a slightly bitter taste in my mouth despite the exhilarating high of a perfect run through the game's final loop. It really wasn't until after the game ended and I had time to reflect on it as a whole that I found its dissatisfying narrative had negatively colored my feelings toward it. Innovation is hard. Dev teams can really only focus on so much, and it's easy to imagine that the inventive leaps this game takes in systemic design were such an ever-evolving and unpredictable journey through uncharted territory that wrapping a narrative around it that was even coherent, let alone actually good, must have been a serious challenge that felt low on the list of priorities. My hope is that more games, including Redfall and whatever else Arcane ends up doing next, will take from the lessons learned from Deathloop to make something that feels like a more thematically complete piece of work. It's hard to remove my disappointment in parts of the game from its real and incredible achievements, but it's also hard to hold its shortcomings against it. Deathloop is an inherently flawed and undeniably brilliant game, and these are two beliefs I'm happy to hold simultaneously. Alright, that's it for the time being. I should be coming back soon enough at some point in my winter break vacation with the top 10 lists. At this point, I'm finding myself thinking, damn, if I just made a few more of these videos throughout the year and got my thoughts out about these games at the time that I actually played them, maybe I wouldn't feel the need to make these huge Game of the Year projects. But, taking the time to reflect on my thoughts on all these games that I've played from various points in the year has been pretty fun. Anyway, for now, goodbye.